Hi again and welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at aorist infinitives and imperatives. On the right here, you can see a chart with the present infinitive forms along with the first and second aorist infinitive forms. There are only two of them for each tense, one for the active and one for the middle. And if you remember, in the present tense, the active infinitive ending was ein, and the middle infinitive ending was esthai. So in the second aorist, if you look at the bottom row of the chart, we use exactly the same endings as in the present tense. The only way we know it's an aorist is that we're using the second aorist stem. So for lambano, the active aorist infinitive would be labain, and the middle aorist would be labesthai. Notice too that there's no augment on the beginning of those. Why? Because we're no longer in the indicative mood. And the augment indicates past time, but outside the indicative mood, the tenses don't indicate anything about time, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. In between those rows, we have the first aorist infinitives, and you can see there the typical features of the first aorist: the sigma tense marker, followed by an alpha connecting vowel. And so we might expect the first aorist active infinitive to be something like lucine, except that the first aorist active infinitive drops the nu on the end, and so the form is just luci for luo. And the middle, first aorist middle infinitive of luo would be lusasthai. There, you notice we essentially have used the same ending as in the present tense, but just changed the connecting vowel from the epsilon, typical of the present, to the alpha, typical of the first aorist. So the first aorist infinitive forms of luo would be luci and lusasthai, and the second aorist infinitive forms would be, for lambano, labain and labesthai. Things to remember here: again, no augment. Once we're outside the indicative mood, into the infinitive or the imperative or other moods, the augment disappears. And remember that we'll have regular changes of the kind we see with all our verbs. So for example, with blepo, when the P at the end of the stem runs into the sigma tense marker, the active first aorist infinitive will be blepsai with a psi, and the middle will be blepsasthai with a psi. The one tricky kind of verb when we get to the aorist infinitive is me verbs, the verbs that end in mu iota instead of the regular endings. And with these verbs, instead of adding psi on the end in the aorist active infinitive, we add ni. And that initial epsilon will often combine in the usual ways with the short vowel at the end of the verb's stem. So if we take didomi, for example, the real stem of didomi is, again, da, delta omicron. When that omicron in da runs up against the epsilon at the beginning of ni, the two join to become u, omicron upsilon, and we get dunai. With histemi, the real stem is sta, and when we add ni on the end of sta, the epsilon just disappears here. The alpha is strong enough to stand by itself, and so we have stani. With tithemi, the real stem is the, and when we add ni after the, the two epsilons meet and form the diphthong epsilon iota, or a. So we get thani. So those active forms of the aorist infinitive for me verbs, they're actually regular within themselves. You've just got to remember that the me verbs form their aorist active infinitive differently. Instead of psi, you put on ni. With the middle for these aorist infinitives. The me verbs are actually much closer to the other verbs. The only thing you need to remember is that there's no connecting vowel. We just have the real stem and add the esthai ending right onto it. So with didomi, we have dos-thai, and with tithemi, we have thes-thai. Histemi, strangely enough, doesn't very often appear in the aorist middle infinitive, so you don't have to worry about learning that one. So what's the meaning of the aorist infinitive? Well, the first thing to remember is that the aorist is actually the default, or the unmarked tense, not the present tense. So the aorist has no special meaning in the infinitive. In fact, aorist infinitives are much more common than the present infinitive, because the present infinitive does carry the implication of present aspect, or some kind of ongoing or repetitive action. But when we're translating an aorist infinitive, we can just use a basic translation with to or ing. So lusai would just be to release or releasing, and labain would be to take or taking. It's important to remember that there's no past time implied by the aorist with infinitive verbs. There's no time at all with tenses outside the indicative mood. So the only thing we're going to read into the aorist tense in these infinitive verbs is aorist aspect, which again is straightforward, unmarked, looking at the action as a simple whole. And so there's not really anything special about aorist infinitives. What about aorist imperatives? Well, let's start by remembering our present imperative forms. There's no first person, remember, in the imperative. You can't directly command yourself to do something. But the active present imperative forms using luo were lue, lueto in the third person singular, and then in the plural, lueta and luetosan. In the middle, with the present imperative, in the singular we had luu and luestho, and in the middle plural we had luesthe and luesthosan. Remember that to get the middle endings, all we did was replace the tau of the active endings in the present tense with the sigma theta. So instead of the third person singular lueto, we had the third person singular middle luestho. And instead of the active lueta, we had the middle luesthe. And instead of the active luetosan, we had the middle luesthosan. The second aorist imperatives use exactly the same endings. So this is really easy. All that you have to remember is to use the second aorist stem of the verb. So lambano is a verb that takes the second aorist, and the second aorist stem is lab. So the second aorist imperatives will be labe in the second person singular, labeto, labeta in the second person plural, labetosan. And in the middle, we'll have again labu, labestho, labesthe, and labesthosan. The aorist forms here, remember, don't take the augment. Again, why? Because the imperative mood is not the indicative mood. Most of the first aorist imperative forms are also quite regular. If you look down the right-hand column here for the first aorist imperative, you'll notice that we have the regular present stem with the sigma tense marker and the alpha connecting vowel. And then we have the same imperative endings that we've used in the present and the second aorist. To, te, and tosan in the active voice, and estho, esthe, and esthosan in the middle voice. And again, the middle endings are really just the active endings substituting sigma theta in place of the tau. There are two places where the first aorist imperative is irregular, though, and it's both of the second person singular forms. Again, probably because these were very commonly used, and the more commonly used something gets, the more it gets knocked around and becomes irregular. So the first aorist imperative of luo in the second person singular is luson. Instead of something like luce, we have luson. That on ending might remind you of some of the second aorist forms, especially in the first person or third person plural. But you can remember that with the first aorist, with that sigma tense marker, this is the only place you'll find the on, or at least one of the few places you'll find that on ending afterward. So luson in the second person singular active, and then in the second person singular middle, we have luci. You might be able to remember this form because it looks a lot like the middle second person ending in the primary endings. Remember my, psi, tai, amatha, estha, entai? Well, this looks a little bit like the psi ending for the second person there. But the trick to remember is that this is the same form. It looks exactly the same as the first aorist active infinitive. So we saw luci earlier, and there we treat it as to loose, or setting free. Here we have the same letters, luci, but now this isn't an infinitive, this is an imperative. And so luci here would mean something like set free or let go. And we'd be speaking to one individual directly, a second person singular. How do you know in a given case which it is? Is luci the aorist, first aorist infinitive, or is it the second person singular imperative? You really just have to judge by context. And so you look at the context and say, does it make more sense for this to be an imperative or an infinitive? What's the meaning of the aorist imperative? Like with the infinitive, the aorist is the default or unmarked tense. So again, the aorist tense brings with it no special meaning at all. And as with the infinitives, aorist imperatives are more common than the present imperatives, because the present tense actually brings with it the special nuance of present aspect. There is, and I can't emphasize this enough, no past time implied by the aorist outside the indicative mood. So again, like with the infinitives, we translate these aorist imperatives just as a normal English imperative. Lusata would mean loose, or release, or destroy. Labe would just mean take, or receive. So again, it's the present imperative that's actually the marked tense. What does that mean? It's the present imperative that brings with it a special sense over and above the basic imperative idea of commanding. So where labe, the aorist imperative, just meant take or receive, the present imperative lambana might carry a continuous idea. Continue taking, go on taking. And where luci would just mean loose or release or destroy, luete, the present imperative, would mean something like start loosing, or start releasing, or start destroying, if the present tense is being used in an inceptive sense. So everything we learned about the present aspect when we were learning about the present tense transfers to present imperatives here. And we just have to remember that it's the present tense with imperatives and infinitives that has a special idea, not the aorist. The aorist is the plain vanilla tense outside the indicative mood. Before we leave aorist imperatives, One of the things that we need to pay attention to is the form of aorist imperatives for the me verbs. These are, again, the verbs who, in their dictionaries form, end in mu iota instead of the regular omega. Some me verbs just take a regular-looking aorist imperative. So deknumi, for example, takes the aorist imperative dekson in the second person singular. This is the dake stem plus the sigma tense marker plus the regular on ending for the second person singular. But some aorist imperatives for me verbs are irregular, and fortunately they tend to be irregular in the same ways. Take, for example, didomi, I give. Notice on the one hand that instead of the verb stem plus a connecting vowel and then the ending, we just have the verb stem with the ending jammed right onto it, because the verb stem itself ends in a vowel that can act kind of like the connecting vowel. Also, the ending in the second person singular is irregular, and this irregular ending is consistent for these irregular me verbs. This is actually the same set of differences that we saw in the present imperative for these same me verbs. So the present imperatives for didomi began with didu, and notice you have there the dida present stem with actually just the epsilon, the regular ending in the second person singular present imperative, stuck on the end. But when the epsilon meets the omicron of the stem, they join to become the u diphthong. So it ends up at least looking like an irregular ending. Didu, and then the rest of these are just the verb stem plus the ending without a connecting vowel. Didato, didate in the second person plural, and didatosan in the third person plural. If we look at the same patterns in the second aorist imperative, we notice, first of all, that the stem has changed to the aorist stem. That's not surprising. So the real stem of didomi is the stem we use in the aorist, and it's da instead of dida. And in the second person singular, we just have this irregular sigma ending. So the second person singular aorist imperative is dos, give. And then the rest of the forms, again, are just the stem plus the regular ending, but now it's the aorist stem, or the real stem of didomi, that we use instead of the present stem. So instead of didato, it's just dato. Instead of didate, it's just date. And instead of didatosan, it's just datosan. Another of these irregular aorist imperatives with the me verbs, it comes with tithemi, I set. Again, we just have the verb stem plus the endings with no connecting vowel, because the real stem of the verb ends in an epsilon this time, ends in a vowel again. And in the second person singular, we have to remember that there's this irregular sigma ending. Again, the present imperatives of tithemi were tithe, which is just the tithe present stem plus the regular epsilon ending, but now when the two epsilons meet, they join to become a long E-class vowel, an eta. So tithe, and then titheto, tithete, and tithetosan. So we look to the second aorist imperative for tithemi, and we have the same pattern. Now the real stem, which we use as the aorist stem of tithemi, is the. The reduplication at the beginning disappears, and instead of tithe, the stem now is just the. And in the second person singular, we use that irregular sigma ending, thes. Then the rest of the forms are theto, theta, and thetosan. Finally, we see similar irregular aorist forms for aphiemi, I release or I forgive. In the present, we have the aphia stem, So in the second person singular with the epsilon ending, that becomes aphiae. This time the epsilons form an epsilon iota diphthong instead of the eta. And then the other forms are aphieto, aphieta, and aphietoson. That's all present imperative. Shifting to the aorist imperative, we have the same kind of pattern, just the stem plus the endings with no connecting vowel. But now we're using the real stem, and it's aphe. So with the sigma ending in the second person singular, that's aphes. And then the other aorist imperative forms are apheto, apheta, and aphetoson. You can learn more about aorist infinitives and imperatives in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek and in Wallace's Basics of New Testament Syntax.